This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast, the Daniel episode, part 2. I am Hal Hammonds, and I am a citizen of heaven, and I am your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. I bring you this message of hope today from Pensacola, Florida. This is report number 48, dated March 3rd in the year of our Lord 2020. I bid God's grace and peace to all my fellow sojourners here in this earthly plane. I remain sound in body, alert in mind, and energized in spirit. In this week's podcast, I will share some more thoughts with you from the shortest of the major prophets. I've been preaching about how jealousy landed Daniel in the lion's den. Have you ever been jealous enough to kill someone? And don't be too quick to answer. I've been reading more from the Daniel dilemma. Satan wants us to adopt the name of his choosing instead of the name God gives to us. It is critical that we just say no. I've been hearing different theories about the hanging gardens of Babylon. It's amazing how the so-called wonders of the world come and go, but the word of the Lord stands forever. I've been playing 7 Wonders, in which you try to build the most glorious civilization possible. To succeed, build something of your own. Don't be satisfied with sabotaging your opponents. Are you ready? Here we go. This is what I've been preaching. The story of Daniel is multifaceted. It's amazing. We could spend months, even years, talking about it. I have 2 episodes that I'm going to spend in the book of Daniel, and one of the lessons I'm giving is on the topic of jealousy, which may not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Daniel, and it may not be the first thing that comes to mind when you read Daniel chapter 6. But nevertheless, here we are. This is a story about faith. This is a story about prayer. This is a story about commitment and God's commitment to us, our commitment to Him. But it begins with a story of jealousy. The Persians have taken over the Babylonian Empire at the end of chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 6. And while administering it, they have divided the empire into 120 different districts called satrapies, and a satrap in charge of each one of these. And they have placed 3 presidents or administrators in charge of these 120 satrapies. Daniel is one of these 3 men, which is a remarkable position for a 80 to 90-year-old man who had, as far as we know, never encountered the Persians, not been known to them at all. But it does seem like perhaps Daniel's words at the end of chapter 5, where he condemned the Babylonians, where he prophesied that they would in fact fall to the Persians, perhaps word got back to those who were in charge of the Persians. However it happened, it happened. And here Daniel is one of the most prominent people in the greatest empire on earth. And he has no doubt been advanced ahead of people who were in line in front of him, let's just say, native Persians, native Medes, people who have served under Cyrus or Darius for years perhaps. And here Daniel is cutting to the front of the line. That probably didn't make him any friends. And here we find out that not only is he prominent among the Persians, but he is also being considered to be in charge of everything, to run the entire empire, essentially elevated over the other 2 presidents. And that makes him a lot of enemies. That creates jealousy. The word jealousy does not appear in my Bible, but that's what it is. That's what we call it in other situations. And jealousy is a killer. If you wonder if that's maybe an exaggeration, read James chapter 4, verse 2, where the readers of James's epistle are accused of murdering people. Now, you might argue that the murder there is philosophical or exaggerated, hyperbolic, as it were, and perhaps it is. Perhaps it's more a murder of someone's reputation or standing rather than murder of their actual body. If you've ever had your reputation murdered, you might have wished it was your body that was murdered after all. It's a very serious crime, and it's a result of jealousy. Going back to the end of chapter 3 in James, we see that that is the case. This jealousy and selfish ambition that motivates humans in general, and far too often people in the Lord's church too. This selfish, prideful self-promotion gets in the way of God's agenda for us, and oftentimes our fellow human beings, our fellow Christians, are collateral damage because of that. That's what brings us to Daniel chapter 6. That's why Daniel is in the lion's den, because these people, if you haven't remembered the story lately, these people have contrived this fake charge, essentially, that nobody's allowed to pray to anybody except for Darius for this period of time. And they know that Daniel's not going to give in to that. They know that Darius is arrogant enough to accept a rule like this. And sure enough, everything falls exactly into place. And by the way, what kind of a plan is this? This is a plan that is rooted in jealousy. And I suggest to you that most plans rooted in jealousy are bad plans. And not only bad or flawed, but doomed to do far more damage to the person who's making the plan than any kind of good that might come. Maybe things worked very, very differently 2.5 millennia ago. I don't know. But if I were Darius and I found out that people in my administration were plotting to overthrow and eventually kill the man that I trusted the most in the government, the one that I was going to hand the entire government over to, that would not make me inclined to promote those people who were making these plans. Very much the opposite, in fact. I suspect it was probably the same back then, too. But that's what jealousy does. It blinds us to all common sense. It blinds us to fairness. It makes it all about what we are getting, or more to the point, probably what we are not getting. The things that we think that we are entitled to. And we ignore the facts of the matter. The fact of the matter is, in Daniel chapter 6, Daniel didn't steal anything from anybody. Daniel didn't take anything that other people were entitled to somehow. He's simply doing his job and apparently doing it better than anybody else was. Some people can't take that. Their egos are just too big for that, as it were. And so it's easier to lash out against the competition, the presumed competition, rather than simply accepting where they are and excelling where they are and perhaps hoping that better things will come along in the future. The Apostle Paul, of course, deals with this constantly. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 19 and following, we see that this battling with his enemies constantly was at its core a jealousy sort of thing. And he warns them. He says, you think that I'm writing 2 Corinthians here to exalt myself, but I'm not. I'm doing it to warn you, to help you get over these character flaws that have put you in this position, because you're going to be held accountable. I'm coming to visit Corinth in not too long, and I would really hate to step in as an apostle and wield the power that is mine in this kind of environment. We can and we must accept more things out of us than that. This is not about us. This is not about self-promotion. This is not about what we can accomplish for ourselves. This is all about serving God as best we possibly can. And the less we think about how this is impacting us in the short term, the more emphasis we can place on what God is doing for us and for others and for the cause at large in the long term. Ultimately, that's far more important. So that's where our thoughts need to be. Anyway, that's what I've been preaching. This is what I've been reading. More this week from Chris Hodges' book, The Daniel Dilemma. I don't know what his qualifications are with regard to Babylonian language. I'm prepared to concede the battle if he wants to say he's smarter than I am with regard to such things. But he insists in his book, at least, that the names that are assigned to Daniel and his friends in Daniel chapter 1 are of particular significance. And whether I agree or not with regard to the particular significance, I think there certainly is a general significance that is given to the idea of changing someone's name. We'll make the specific point first, and then we'll back up and look at the larger point. Supposedly, the name in Babylonian, Belteshazzar, which is given to Daniel, means "Lady, protect the king." That seems an odd name to give to somebody on a couple of different levels. Not the least of which is you're calling this man a woman, or a young man at least, calling him a woman, which probably was not received all that well. I don't know how you would feel about being called a woman if you're a man in 21st century America. Back then it would have been an insult, no question about that. And the idea of putting his emphasis on protecting the king, serving the king, rather than the God of his ancestors, which he has been serving all of his life, he continues to serve. Daniel's own name, by the way, means God is my judge. So we're taking emphasis off of God and placing it onto Nebuchadnezzar. That's got to be insulting to a certain degree. So there may be a specific reason why Daniel was given that particular name, but whether it was or was not significant, whether that is or is not the meaning of the name itself, the larger point is this. The very first thing that happens when these young Hebrew boys come into Babylon, the very first thing is they lose their name. Nebuchadnezzar robs them of their identity, or tries to, at least. Now, if you feel like that is not that big of a deal, especially in the context of a book where this man is later on going to be thrown into a lion's den, his friends are going to be thrown into a fiery furnace, I get that point. But I would ask you how you would feel if someone tried to rename you or rename your children. That is an incredibly offensive and intrusive act. You are no longer who you are, who you have been your entire life. That is the effort that is being made. Now, in the book of Daniel, it becomes clear that this effort to rob Daniel of his nationalism, rob him of his faith, is going to fail because Daniel is defined by more than simply his name. But it's a reminder for us as we live our lives in faith, as we live in Satan's world, that the devil is constantly doing this. He's trying to get us to define ourselves on his terms rather than our terms. I have been renamed any number of times. I'm sure you have as well. I've been called a bigot. I've been called a legalist. I've been called a hypocrite. On and on we can go. This is the devil's way of trying to identify us to other people, and ultimately to ourselves also. If he can convince ourselves that we are in fact defined as he has defined us, we lose our connection to God. And that's why we have to hold tightly to the name that God has given us, to remember who we truly are, no matter who we may be accused of being by other people. And remember also, the same thing happened to Jesus. Matthew chapter 11, verse 19, he's accused of being a drunk and a glutton. Chapter 12 and verse 24, he's accused of having his powers from the power of the devil. That is a blasphemous kind of thing. It is an attempt to repackage Jesus in the trappings that the devil is assigning to him. Jesus doesn't play that game. And I don't see any indication in the Bible that this distracted him in the slightest. This is the way it happens. This is one of the tactics of the devil. And things haven't changed. The devil is still doing the same kind of thing. What we need to do is respect what God has done for us. Because God did what Satan is trying to do. God came into our lives and God changed our name. Now, you can take offense at that if you want to, but instead what you ought to do is take delight in that, because the name that God has given you is a far greater name. This happened to Jesus, again, as it does for us. Just as the devil tried to rename Jesus, God did rename Jesus. The Father did rename Jesus. At the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow. The name that is above every name. Philippians chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. God assigns Jesus this name, and it's a glorious name. And that's what he does for us. Prophetically speaking, go back to Isaiah chapter 62 and verse 1. For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake, I will not keep quiet until her righteousness goes forth like brightness, and her salvation like a torch that is burning. The nations will see your righteousness, and all kings your glory, and you will be called by a new name, which the mouth of the Lord will designate. You will also be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and the royal diadem in the hand of your God. It will no longer be said of you forsaken, nor of your land will be called any more desolate, but you will be called, my delight is in her, and your land married. For the Lord delights in you, and to him your land will be married. For as a young man marries a virgin, so your sons will marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so your God will rejoice over you. There's a lot of debate over whether this passage is talking literally about the name Christian that is given to the saints in the early days of the church. Whether it is or not is really not the point. The main point is this, that God is marrying us. God is connecting to us. In New Testament terms, we're marrying the Son. We're marrying Jesus. But either way, there is a spiritual joining of families here. We are being taken into God's family. And as is the case in our families, traditionally in our culture, the wife takes the name of the husband. And such is the case with God. We are given his name. We are not identified by our own character, our own past, our own heritage, but rather by who God is. This is the name that he assigns to us. And again, it is a glorious name, one that we are proud to wear. So instead of being insulted, instead of being offended if someone assigns some nefarious charge to being a Christian, instead we're rejoicing in this. That's what Peter says, even in the first century, this is going on. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 16, if anyone accuses you of being a Christian, you delight in that name, he says. It's attaching you to Jesus. They may think it's a bad thing, but you know it is a glorious thing. Do not accept the devil's name for yourself. Rejoice in the name that God has given you, the name Christian. Anyway, that's what I've been reading. This is what I've been hearing. The first century Jewish historian Josephus writes of a story that he had heard from a Babylonian historian 300 years before. A story of how Nebuchadnezzar, the man that we read about in the book of Daniel, married a Persian princess, and to impress her, to remind her of the glories of her homeland, made for her a garden, a glorious garden, one that involved multiple stories of buildings and terraces and lattices and all manner of trees and flowering plants. It was a wonder in every sense of the word. That story from Josephus is the only story that we have that attributes the Hanging Gardens to Nebuchadnezzar. It's now generally assumed that he built this, but we do not really have very much historical record at all of that. In fact, there are only 5 sources that refer to the Hanging Gardens at all. That's not to say that they didn't exist. They almost certainly did exist. Certainly the ancient Greeks thought that they existed. The scholars of the Greeks, who had much better knowledge, of course, of the ancient world than we do, thought that this story merited its inclusion as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But it's remarkable that we have so little information about it, that we have no drawings, we have no first-hand accounts, we have really very little information about it at all. What we have just whets our appetite, as it were. And what I'd like to do here for a couple of minutes here this week is to compare the Hanging Gardens to a true wonder of the ancient world. The Hanging Gardens is gone, and it will never come back. It is gone forever. We can't even point to a place on the map where it once existed. We don't know. We have some idea. That idea may or may not be close, but if it did in fact exist, and we generally assume that it did, we don't know where it was, and we'll certainly never see it again. There's no evidence of it that exists anymore. There were no eyewitness accounts of it. No one, at least none that survived to this point. Surely if they existed, someone talked about it, someone wrote about it. But there is no first-hand account at all that remains anymore of what the Hanging Gardens were, what they looked like. No drawings, no reliefs, no historical records at all. And beyond that, there is considerable question as to exactly how remarkable they were in a historical perspective. I say that because one theory is that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon is essentially a corruption of the story of another garden. One that is very well documented, in fact. It is well established that 100 or so years before Nebuchadnezzar, the Assyrian emperor Sennacherib built a remarkable system of gardens in Nineveh. And that one is, we have reliefs of that. We have historical records of that. It could be that that gave rise to the idea in Nebuchadnezzar's mind to build a similar thing or a greater thing in Babylon. Maybe the Babylonian thing is entirely a myth. Then maybe it's all based on this previous garden that had been built in Assyria. Certainly, there's no indication to think that this is a absolutely remarkable, without precedent, accomplishment of archaeology or any such thing as that. Now, compare that with the Bible, if you will. The Bible is, in many instances, older than the Hanging Gardens. Much of the Bible was completed, probably half or more of the Bible was completed before this. It covers a much, much wider span. And the Bible is, in fact, documented and written down by eyewitnesses. Not all of it, but much of it. And the New Testament is entirely written by eyewitnesses. Luke chapter 1, the first few verses of it, as Luke is writing to Theophilus, he emphasizes the importance of these eyewitnesses, that he had done a great deal of research, talking not only to the Apostle Paul, who traveled with regularly, but also to others who had known Jesus, who had known the people who knew Jesus, and the things that he wrote down were, if not first-hand accounts, at least second-hand accounts of what had been going on in the life of the early church, in the life of Jesus himself, and the book that he writes in that we know as the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. Much of that was, in fact, a first-hand account. Luke was present for much of this. That is something that can't be said of the Hanging Gardens. Peter emphasizes this in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 16, "For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, such an honor as this was made to him by the majestic glory, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain." He, along with his friends James and John, heard this voice. They're not making this up. This is not a story they heard from somebody who heard it from somebody else. They were there. They were eyewitnesses to these things. So the Bible, unlike the Hanging Gardens, still does exist, even though much of it is older than the gardens claim to have been. The Bible is attested to by eyewitnesses, written down by eyewitnesses. And of course, it is utterly original. There are other ancient texts. There are other religious texts. There are other things that, in the minds of some anyway, resemble the Bible, but that's nonsense. Whether you're talking about the Quran, you're talking about the writings of Confucius, or anybody else that you want to talk about. The Bible is much, much older. The Bible is much, much more consistent, morally superior. Maybe that's a judgment call in your mind, but nevertheless, the Bible is a remarkable document. No matter how critical you may be, no matter how much of an unbeliever you may be, there's no question that the Bible in and of itself is an astounding document. And the fact that it has been preserved and preserved so well, so accurately for so long of a time, always speaking to the same central core message of a God who loves his people, who has protected his people and guided them through life and protected them for a future life that is waiting for them after this life is over. There's nothing like the Bible. This is surely the greatest wonder of all. You can have the pyramids. You can have the Hanging Gardens. I'll take the Bible every time. Anyway, that's what I've been hearing. If you want to stop listening at this point and go your way, I hope you've found the message instructive, inspiring, and most of all, faithful to God's Word. Please don't forget to like, rate, share, subscribe, and follow. But if you stick around for a few more minutes, I would like to share with you a way to amuse yourself in a wholesome manner while waiting here in Satan's world, and perhaps pick up a spiritual point or two in the process. This is what I've been playing. Well, I thought it was only appropriate, if we were going to discuss the Hanging Gardens of Babylon in the previous segment, that we would discuss Seven Wonders, the board game, in the final segment. Seven Wonders is rightly considered by many to be a modern classic. Our family has played it many, many times over the years, for many, many years. One of the very first modern board games that we really got into. I mentioned a few months ago that if someone was coming to me for a recommendation on what kind of game to play to get started in modern board gaming, I recommend Azul. If someone is looking for a step up from that, something a little bit more complicated, my first recommendation generally is Seven Wonders. It's a tremendous game. We really, really love it. Seven Wonders works like this. You are basically building a civilization around one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Maybe it's the Hanging Gardens or the Great Pyramid or the library at Alexandria, whatever it happens to be. You play up to 7 players because there's 7 great wonders. And you are maybe advancing in military, or maybe it's in science, or in your ability to run an economic engine, whatever it happens to be. You're building this civilization around this wonder, and hopefully building onto the wonder itself, which helps you in the various areas of development. And at the end of 3 rounds, the one who has the best civilization is the winner. That's the theory, at least, what you're doing in this game. In reality, it's a board game, and you are collecting points, and you do that in a variety of areas. And you play 3 rounds, and the one who has the most points at the end of the game is the winner. That's the idea behind Seven Wonders. And it all centers around this idea of card drafting. And let me explain exactly what card drafting is for those who don't know. In Seven Wonders, you're given a hand of 7 cards to begin your round with. You have 3 rounds again, and you start with 7 cards in each round. And you play one of those cards, and then you pass the rest of them to your neighbor. You're sitting in a circle, presumably, and in the first round, you pass to the left, and then you pass to the right in the second round, and then to the left again in the the third round. So you'll pass 6 cards and you'll get 6 cards back from this person to your right. And you'll play one of those cards and you'll pass the remainder, and et cetera, et cetera. And you wind up playing 6 cards and discarding 1. And those cards may be a way to gather resources, or they may be a special building that's going to give you points, or it may be advancing your scientific knowledge, or whatever it happens to be. The idea basically is that you set yourself up for long-term success by collecting the things that you want that are going to help you build your engine and help you get to where you want to be in your civilization. Now, the thing is this. When you pass the cards to your neighbor, the neighbor gets to use the cards that you don't use. And as wonderful as they may be for you, they may be equally wonderful or more so for your neighbor. And that introduces the concept of hate drafting, which is kind of the ugly stepsister of card drafting. Basically, with hate drafting, you find yourself in a position where I can't afford to pass this card to the person on my left or whatever. I don't have any scientific cards in front of me. Say it's the third round, and I'm looking to my person on the left, and she has 5 science cards. And this card's going to help her a lot because they get increasingly valuable. Science does, at least, as the game goes on. I don't have any. It's going to be worth 1 point to me. It may be worth 7 points to her. So I'm left in a position here. Do I want to pick a card that will help me and give me several points, or do I pick this card that really doesn't help me very much but keeps her from being benefited tremendously? I take a card that I don't especially want but that she wants a lot. That's hate drafting. And it's a good way to get angry scowls. It's a good way to get people to shake their fist at you or whatever. It's part of the game. Everybody realizes that it's part of the game. And hopefully if you've got a good crowd of people that you're playing with, nobody's going to take any of this too seriously. But there is this, and you need to consider this. If you spend your entire game, especially in the later rounds, if you spend your game picking cards that you're afraid are going to hurt you because somebody else is going to use them, and you never do anything of your own, you're going to lose the game. You just can't spend the entire game hate drafting. You'll drive yourself crazy in the first place, and you'll never build anything of your own in the second place. There is a sense in which you need to be defensive. You need to protect yourself from too much success with your opponents. But you have to put yourself in a position where you yourself can succeed. And that's a great lesson for us with regard to the spiritual warfare that we're engaged in. We talk a lot about the devil and his advances. We talk about the roaring lion that seeks to devour us. We talk about the armor of God that's given to us in Ephesians chapter 6 and the sword of the Spirit that we're given to do battle against him. There is, in fact, a very real conflict. There are bad guys out there, and we need to not give them too much armament. We need to make sure that they don't get too much opportunity to advance in this spiritual warfare. But while we're doing that, we need to make sure that we stay positive also. It's not enough simply to deny victory to the devil. We have to claim victory ourselves. We have to be successful in our conflict with the devil. The book of Revelation describes 7 churches that were having varying degrees of success in their battle against the devil. And one of them, the first one, the church at Ephesus, is doing quite well in its defensive warfare, but they have left their first love. Verse number 2 through 4 tell us that they've left their first love. As good as they've been opposing evil, they have not built anything positive. And that's a problem for us. We need to make sure that we do better than that. Ephesians chapter 4 is a good example of that. We talked about chapter 6 and the armor of God that's given to us, the negative warfare that we fight. But there's a positive warfare also. We need to make sure we emphasize this. In Ephesians 4, verse 11, the text says, "And he gave some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. As a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into him who is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love." See, this positive growth, stepping forward toward spiritual things. This, in a very real sense, arms us for the negative warfare. All these bad people, all these bad things that are going out there in the world, they're real. But sometimes the best thing that we can do to arm ourselves against such things is by building up a strong positive force for righteousness in ourselves and in our brethren. The more united we can be in something we're building for Christ, the more effective we're going to be in fighting against the things that the workers of evil are trying to build for the devil. Anyway, that's why I've been playing.
Thank you for listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. If you profited from your time here, I have a few requests of you. Please pray for me and for this work. We need more citizens of heaven, and our prayer is that we be part of achieving this objective. Please subscribe to this podcast and give a good rating on iTunes and other sites that allow you to do such things, and spread the word to your friends. Please follow my work through my website, www.halhammonds.com. There you'll find links to articles, videos, and books of mine. Seek me out on social media. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and especially Facebook. Look for me and for my pages, The Final Word, The Preacher, 20 Pages a Week, and Citizen of Heaven. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammonds, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.